So, we hear a lot these days about how we should tolerate people who are different from us, right? Well, just for the record, I want to tell you boldly and without any qualifiers, we should stop tolerating people who are different. If that surprises you, which I hope it does, just give me a few minutes to unpack it, because I don't mean what some people mean by that phrase. And as a lead into this conversation, and as a way to annoy you so you won't miss me so much next week, we all know what this is, right? It's a prism. And what does a prism do? Well, in school, we all learned that a prism breaks down white light into its component colors, which you can see in this image if you imagine that the light is going from left to right. And that is, of course, true. But I feel the need to tell you two things you may or may not have learned in school. The first is pretty simple, really. It's just that a prism does something else, which is almost more interesting. A prism can take colored light at the appropriate angles and combines them into white light, which you can see in the same image if you imagine the light is traveling from right to left. Prisms actually work in both directions. If you didn't learn that in high school, it's because it's very hard to set up that experiment. But the second thing you may not have learned in school, and I'd love to know if you did, is that white light does not actually exist, except in your mind. White light does not exist. I mean, you have to remember, light is a wave of photons, and different wavelengths give us different colors. Like here's a full spectrum of visible light, and each color has a range of wavelengths. For example, green is not a single color, but it's a band extending from, 490 to 560 or something. This spectrum shows the complete visible spectrum. Do you see any white in there? No, because there's no such thing as white light. We have violet, purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. There is no white photons. White light does not exist. But of course, it does exist in our minds. Our eyes combine the full spectrum of colors and create a sensation in our brain that we call white light. But white light does not exist. And actually, I want to prove it right here, because you look skeptical. You're probably more skeptical why I'm even doing it. This is called a Newton disk. It's made up of the same principal colors. And the thing is, if you spin this really fast, which I can't do on a pencil, all the colors will disappear and it will become white. But clearly there's no white on here, is there? Now, I could have geeked out and got an electric motor and played around for a while, but I let somebody with more time on their hands do that for me. So this guy has taken, that's a physical disc, and you can see a vertical stick. Behind it, it's an electric motor. But when he turns on the motor and lets it get up to speed, it looks like that. And it's slightly pink because it's a complicated story. When photons of different colors come together, they collectively create what we call white light. And the reason I'm talking about this is because that is also how we create community. Different people with different backgrounds, ideas, and opinions come together. They retain their individuality, and yet we collectively create something new called community. And with light, if any one color is missing from the spectrum, we do not get white. We need the full spectrum if we want to create white light. And in our community, we need everyone right here to make this community what it is. If anyone is excluded, we become a different community. We become less. As a community, we also need the full spectrum, not of light, but of people. And that's why I said earlier we should stop tolerating other people, because tolerating other people is actually not really usually very inclusive. I mean, you can easily tolerate a person by ignoring them, for example, but then you miss out on the gift of that person. Instead, our differences should be embraced, lifted up, incorporated, celebrated, not just tolerated. In fact, if the best you can do with another person is tolerate them, I'm going to say maybe try a bit harder. Or, for bonus points, figure out why you are so triggered by the gift of another person. because when somebody triggers us, it's a great opportunity for us to ask ourselves what that says about us, nothing about the other person. In an inclusive community, individuals are celebrated for who they are, not simply their ability to fit in. And differences are not tolerated, they are sought out, celebrated. I mean, think about it. There's no need to tolerate someone who you think of as an equal, because that's simply called friendship. Tolerating people is like filtering out certain colors from the visible spectrum. So we need to stop tolerating people and start embracing everyone in the community for the gift that they are. Which brings us to our reading from Acts today. And thank you, Nicola, for that long reading. I actually shortened it a bit, and now I have to unpack it even more. But I will argue, and I always argue, that Acts chapter 10, all of it, is the most important chapter in the Bible for the church. And I love saying that out loud. But why would I say Acts 10 is the most important chapter for the church? Well, it's because without the story described in Acts 10, there wouldn't be a Christian church today. I mean, I know on the surface it's a bit of a strange reading, right? Some guy, Peter, who, let's be honest, we don't know a whole lot about, has a dream about a bed sheet full of animals descending from the heavens, and he has to decide which ones to eat. And Peter decides to reject certain animals because traditionally they're called unclean. But in the dream, God declares the animals to be clean, all of them, meaning that none of the animals are unclean. All of the animals are clean. The story sounds either irrelevant or insane, depending on how you look at it, until we remember what was happening at the time. So just need a little bit of history, because next week is Pentecost, traditionally taken to be the birth of the Christian church. And today's reading is a crucial part of the story. You know, you can't really pin down the beginning of Christianity. I mean, some people would start with Jesus as a disciple of John. Or we could start with Jesus' public ministry with the disciples. But no matter how we imagine the movement started, the Jesus movement, sometimes referred to as the Way, started as a sect within Judaism. Their leader, Jesus, and all the disciples were Jewish, and none of them would have ever heard the word Christian in their lifetimes. So how did a Jewish sect become a non-Jewish religion? Well, that's a really long story, but one of the key steps was the acceptance of non-Jewish people as followers of Jesus. And most of the book of Acts is about the interplay between Jewish followers of Jesus and non-Jewish followers of Jesus. And this came to a head as the Jesus movement expanded geographically and theologically. And Acts 10 was a decisive point in the story. The story is, of course, not about eating animals at all. The story is about which people are clean and which are unclean. As it said in the reading, Jewish tradition declared that non-Jews were unclean. But in the dream, God declared everyone is clean. In other words, the Jesus Club was free to welcome everyone into their midst. What God has called clean, we must not call unclean. Peter, one of the leaders of the day, was under the belief that only Jewish people could be part of the Jesus movement. But then he had his dream and met Cornelius. You know, it's funny, to the early Jesus Club, Cornelius was a problem. I mean, Cornelius was a devout person who prayed to God. He helped people in need. He wanted to follow Jesus. But he wasn't Jewish. How is this going to work out? So the Jesus movement had to make an important decision. Did they want to maintain a narrow cultural identity? Or did they want to maintain their commitment to the principle of inclusivity that Jesus lived and taught? Did the group want to maintain their cultural biases? Or did they want to live a more inclusive life? In short, the early Jesus movement had to choose between accepting Cornelius or giving up on Jesus. And they chose to accept Cornelius. And that's why I argue Acts 10 is the most important chapter in the Bible for the church. Maybe not for Christians, actually, but for the church. Because if Peter had failed to get the message, if Peter had not got the point of the dream, the Jesus Club would have remained a small sect within a small religion. It would never have embraced all people as potential members of the Jesus Club. Because Christian principles are fundamentally inclusive. Now, before you correct me, yes, I'm well aware the church has not always lived into that vision particularly well. The Christian church has made many disastrous trips into racist and exclusivist behavior, including, for a short list, the Crusades against Muslims, including centuries of support for slavery, including the conquest of North America at the expense of the indigenous people, including the current rise of Christian nationalism on our own streets even. And I could name other examples. But those were mistakes, deviations from Christian aspirations, not the way the Christian church should behave. The fundamental basis of Christianity from Acts 10 is the principle that all people are children of God, period. What God has called clean, we must not call unclean. I often wonder who we identify with this in this story when we read it, but I suspect most of us identify with Peter. Peter represents the establishment, the established group. Peter represents the status quo. Perhaps like Peter, we want to cling to our past. Perhaps like Peter, we do not always appreciate the changing social demographics around us. Perhaps like Peter, we feel we are being pushed into the margins of our own society. Because as you may have noticed, we are surrounded by people who are different from us. Perhaps we struggle to embrace people who, historically, we have called unclean. But God has called them clean. But wait, I hear you. We're inclusive people. I mean, look around this church, for example. This congregation is not a monoculture. I know, and I celebrate that every single week. In many ways, we're inclusive people. But I invite all of us, including me, by the way, this week, just this week, to pay attention in the coming week and to look for people who trigger us. Because knowing who triggers us can be a great clue as to where we still struggle with inclusion. And if you do see someone who triggers you, I invite you to say to yourself, probably to your own self, what God has called clean, we must not call unclean. And then maybe look at that person with fresh eyes and see if that makes a difference. Now, we all know this sounds great in principle, and it sounds even better in a sermon. But humans, let's be honest, have always struggled to live out the vision of inclusion. Humans do seem to be quite tribal in nature. But maybe we can overcome our tribal biases at least a bit by reminding ourselves what God has called clean, we must not call unclean. It's interesting we get this teaching on May 17th because May 17th is widely recognized as the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, which is a worldwide celebration of sexual and gender diversities. The struggle against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia is very old, of course. But 36 years ago today, one milestone in that struggle was reached. Because on May 17, 1990, the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from the official list of diseases. Prior to that time, homosexuality was classified as a disease that could and should be fixed. But 36 years ago, it was officially declared homosexuality is not actually a disease. In spite of that, gender and sexuality are two aspects of humanity that continue to be seen as barriers to separate people into us and them. That can defy inclusion and therefore prevent us from being the community that we could be. And we all see that lack of inclusion played out. I've seen it played out in the United Church of Canada. Let me tell you about a friend. I'll call her Susan. Susan and I attended seminary at Emmanuel College together at the same time. We started the same year. We had many classes together. We both learned a great deal from each other. She was an amazing person. Susan was also the first trans woman to be ordained by a mainline church anywhere in the world. We often think of the United Church as a fairly open-minded, progressive community, but Susan didn't really have an easy go of it either. Her internship placement was, unsurprisingly, selected with a fair bit of care. But in spite of that, her internship included struggles dealing with people who projected their own hatred onto her. Susan had a wonderful ministry of presence. In her case, in some cases, just showing up was a ministry in itself. But she was there because of her deep love for the church and for Jesus. She was an inspiration. Many people miss seeing the true gift of Susan because they could not see past her identity as a trans woman. But in many ways, I have to tell you, that was one of the least interesting things about her. Susan discovered church when she was middle-aged. She sort of accidentally walked into Trinity St. Paul's on Bloor Street, and she fell in love with the community. And Susan said all the time to anyone who would listen, which was at least twice a week, that she came for the community and stayed for the Jesus. She was a complete Jesus addict. So for me, the most interesting thing about Susan had nothing to do with her gender or her sexuality. I was just stunned anyone would decide to enter professional ministry in the United Church of Canada having only experienced one congregation. I frequently reminded Susan that the Trinity St. Paul's is maybe not the most typical United Church, and I tried to help her understand the breadth of congregational realities she would face during her ministry. I mean, consider me. Before I attended seminary, I'd been an active member of many congregations. I have chaired every single committee there is except the UCW. And no, that's not an offer. I've seen congregational dynamics in a variety of congregational settings before I went to seminary. I had a rough idea what I was getting myself into, I think, before I went to seminary. But for Susan to take on ministry leadership based only on her experiences of TSP was brave, bold, and daring. Sadly, many people could only see Susan as what she represented to them as a trans woman. And she was that, big time. But she was a massive Jesus lover, too. She was and still is a gift to our church. Susan was a gift, not just because she was a trans woman, but simply because she was Susan. Susan's story is not ancient history. It happened in my lifetime, in my own seminary, in my own church. And it's still happening, which is why May 17th still matters. And of course, May 17th is a good time to lift up gender and sexuality. But I want to close with a broader question, which would simply be what barriers exist in our own minds that we use to separate people into us and them? And are those healthy barriers? 2,000 years ago, the Jesus Club struggled to accept non-Jewish people. Is there anyone in our own community we struggle to accept? Or do we actually live and breathe into the idea we are all children of God? White light does not exist as a single thing. It only exists when every color shows up together. Community is the same way. We only become what God intended when the full spectrum is present. Every wavelength, every color, every person. What God has called clean, we must not call unclean. Amen.